Coming up, the case for Scottish independence.
The fundamental reason for independence is Scotland is a nation, and nations, by and large, on the whole, are better governing themselves and allowing decisions to be taken by other nations for them.
Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond discusses his country's strong economy, unrivaled innovation, and why it should not be ruled from London. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Alexander Elliot Anderson Salmond became First Minister in May 2007. He has also served as MP for the Banff and Buchan constituency in the House of Commons at Westminster from 1997 to 2010. He worked for the Government Economic Service, later with the Royal Bank of Scotland as an energy economist, where he wrote and broadcast for both domestic and international media. And I believe that the RBS BBC oil index that he devised is still used today.
Andrew Carnegie remains admired for his business success, but especially for his philanthropy. And that remains obviously totally influential to this day. His commitment to culture, to education, and above all, to peace. His foundation of the Church Peace Union, now this Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, is one of the very important examples of that. Frederick Lynch, who worked with Carnegie for many years, notes that Carnegie had never taken more delight in any of his gifts than in this child of his later years. Therefore, it is a real privilege as First Minister of Scotland to speak here about Scotland's economy, about our place in the world, and in doing so, to honour one of Scotland's greatest sons. On the 18th of September next year, the people of Scotland will choose whether Scotland should become an independent country. Now, in talking about that decision this afternoon, I want to focus a lot on economic issues, but more than that, I want to articulate that the underlying motivation for this is a simple, devastating, and obviously true argument that the best people to take decisions about Scotland are the people who choose to live and work in Scotland. And I want to also suggest why that process of Scottish self-determination is an exemplar in the conduct of international relations. First, however, I'd like to make one point clear. Scotland is already a successful nation. That's recognised by many companies around the world, especially in the United States. The accountancy firm Ernst & Young publishes every year a comprehensive survey which ranks the different parts of the United Kingdom and their success in attracting inward mobile investment. The current survey shows that Scotland is easily the most successful part of the UK for attracting these jobs, ahead of all other areas, including the City of London. And Ernst & Young's also found that Scotland is by some distance the most productive location across the UK for attracting research and development jobs in particular. Now, much of that reason for that success is Scotland's reputation and tradition and innovation. I mean, Scots, as we know, invented the television, the telephone, the bicycle, the condensing steam engine, MRI scanners, ATMs, and Dolly the sheep. Professor Arthur Herman, now at the American Enterprise Institute, has argued that Scotland invented the modern world. Now, modesty would have forbidden a First Minister of Scotland to make that claim, but I'm really, really pleased that an American has made it. Now, all of that is a result of the inventiveness, the ingenuity of the people living and working in Scotland. And there's a really important point here, and this is one that Carnegie really understood. Scotland's industrial preeminence in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, the sheer volume of inventions that came from our country, had its origins in the fact that we were the first society on earth to introduce universal education. So by educating more people than other nations, we nurtured the individuals to have the skill and talent to innovate and to invent. Now, the lesson we should take from that holds true to this day. One of the first actions that the government I lead took in 2007 was to re-establish in Scotland the principle of free higher education. And the Scottish Government is absolutely committed to ensuring schools, colleges, universities are accessible to all and are among the best in the world. And that's an aspiration which Carnegie identified with. In Carnegie's biography of James Watt, he referred to, quote, "the doctrine of compulsory education for all the people, the secret of Scotland's progress." And in 1901, of course, he endowed Scotland's universities with a bequest of $10 million. That's worth approximately $250 million in today's money. And in contrast, the entire public support in 1901 for the 4 then Scottish universities, the ancient universities, was around £50,000. That legacy has helped some 100,000 Scottish students since then and continues to do, of course, much good to this day. Now, as things stand just now, the Times Higher Educational Supplement highlights that Scotland has 4 universities in the world's top 200, more per head of population than any country in the world except Switzerland. And according to research conducted in 2009, we rank first in the world in terms of research productivity per unit of GDP and second in the world in terms of research impact. Our life sciences research achieved global fame, of course, from the Roslin Institute when they cloned Dolly the sheep, and of course it's an exceptionally strong industry in Scotland, and we have a strong tradition of working collaboratively with that industry. Scotland also has major opportunities in the energy sector. Research that was published last month demonstrated that Scotland is responsible for some 2/3 of the European Union's oil production. In fact, more than half of the wholesale value of Scotland's oil and gas reserve, potentially more than $2 trillion worth, remains to be recovered from the waters around Scotland. As a result, last year saw a record level of investment in the North Sea oil and gas sector. Supply chain companies based in Scotland now sell to more than 100 countries around the world, and Aberdeen is the largest energy centre on the planet after Houston. Now, beyond that, Scotland has the ambition and the potential to become the renewable energy powerhouse of the continent of Europe. We have 10% of Europe's wave power potential, a quarter of offshore and tidal power potential. The Pentland Firth has been described memorably as the Saudi Arabia of tidal power. Glasgow is Europe's largest research base for offshore wind energy. Scotland leads the world in the development of wave and tidal technology. President Obama, in his inauguration speech this January, made it clear that he wanted the United States to lead the transition to sustainable energy resources. And you couldn't have a better partner for achieving that than Scotland. Indeed, the Scottish Government's partner in the Saltire Prize for Innovation for the commercial development of wave and tidal power is the National Geographic, the world's largest educational charity, and of course, co-founded by another prominent Scot, Alexander Graham Bell. In addition, our food and drink exports are going from strength to strength. In fact, one of Scotland's greatest inventions of all has seen the value of its exports increase by almost a quarter in the last 2 years. Our global whisky sales were worth over $6 billion in 2012. Now, Carnegie described whisky as the best as well as the most fashionable medicine of the day. I'm not sure that advertising standards these days would allow me to promote whisky as a medicine now, but you get the basic idea, I think. Now, Carnegie, I'm sure, would have been delighted to see that the United States remains the top Scotch whisky market in the world. Sales increased by 16% last year, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you for contributing. I'm providing this outline of Scotland's economic strengths, partly, of course, to promote Scotland as a fantastic place for investment, but also underlines the massive potential of an independent Scotland. If Scotland were an independent nation now, in 2013, we would have the 8th highest gross domestic product per capita in the developed world. That would still be behind the United States in 4th place, but significantly ahead of the United Kingdom, which is in 16th place. A long-term financial strength for Scotland is demonstrated time and time again by official figures. In every one of the last 30 years, Scotland has generated more tax revenue than the average of the UK as a whole. Over the past 5 years, we've had a stronger fiscal position in the UK by the equivalent of almost $19 billion. Our fiscal deficit is smaller than the UK's, and indeed is smaller than many countries across the European Union. In all of this, there's a wider point about fiscal responsibility. At present, the Scottish Government is responsible for approximately 60% of public spending in Scotland, but controls just 7% of the taxation base of the country. This will soon rise in the next year to around 15%, but 15% is a long way from control of the taxation base. So to reverse a phrase first coined in this country, the Scottish Parliament currently endures representation without taxation, It's a fundamental problem. It's not sustainable or healthy or efficient for Scotland or indeed for the rest of the United Kingdom. An independent Scotland would be responsible for 100% of taxation, and that would give us the powers that we require to create prosperity and make Scotland a fairer society. Powers over taxation like corporation tax, the Scottish Government could be able to set a competitive rate to attract new investment to Scotland, to encourage key industries, to counterbalance the gravitational pull of London and the southeast of England. The Scottish Government have modelled a 3%, the effect of a 3% reduction in corporation tax, and concluded that such a step would create 27,000 long-term jobs and would encourage the rebalancing of the economy by boosting exports. Crucially, a parliament in Scotland would understand the importance and the needs of economic sectors of most importance to our country. An example of that would be a couple of years ago when the UK government imposed a supplementary charge on North Sea oil without any prior consultation whatsoever. That move, since reversed with positive results, it temporarily reduced, indeed resulted in almost freeze in investment in the North Sea. It is inconceivable that such a change would have been introduced in independent Scotland. Now, those who argue against Scottish independence sometimes frame the argument in terms of perceived risk. In fact, they always frame the argument in terms of perceived risk. The real economic risk for Scotland, I would submit, lie in our current constitutional position. The risk of oil revenues continuing to be used exclusively for current expenditure rather than providing long-term economic security. The risk of inequality rising further, as it has done at UK level over each of the last 35 years. The risk of taxation and welfare policies being designed in London as opposed to designed for Scottish circumstances. Independence, I would submit, replaces these risks with a certainty, and that certainty is whatever challenges we wish to face, whatever opportunities we wish to seize, Scotland's future would be in Scottish hands. Independence allows us to make our own policies, to match our own priorities and our own values. Ladies and gentlemen, an American president once famously said that the business of America is business. Now, as a canny Scot, I can recognize that sentiment. However, I also know that the Coolidge quotation is not the fundamental of American society. The foundation principle of this republic is popular sovereignty. The real business of America is not business, but democracy. Therefore, it's worth reflecting on something really, really important: how the process of Scottish self-determination is offering an exemplar to the rest of the planet. For the best part of a century, Scotland has been on a constitutional journey. Despite the passion of the argument, not a single person has lost their life arguing for or against Scottish independence. Nobody's had so much as a nosebleed in this debate. The process has been peaceful, polite, constitutional. The Edinburgh Agreement, which I signed with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom last October, is the culmination of that process. Both Scotland and London agreed on the terms of a popular referendum, agreed to accept the result, and crucially, in Clause 30 of that agreement, agreed to work in the best interests of the peoples of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom, following the result, whatever it may be. Both the Declaration of Arbroath back in 1320, with its search for Scottish legitimacy, and the American Declaration of Independence with its glorious affirmation of popular sovereignty, were sealed in the force of arms and struggle. Now the process of Scottish self-determination is signed by a handshake and determined in a democratic referendum of the people. Even in modern times, this is a rare and precious process, and one which stands as an exemplar to the rest of the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, since Andrew Carnegie's day and his search for peace, the world has changed fundamentally. Global markets have opened to countries large and small. Threats to international security don't come, by and large, from territorial acquisition. They come from international terrorism or international criminality. In this environment, the disadvantages of smaller nations have disappeared. They're now benefiting from the natural economic strength, which is flexibility, speed of decision-making, the ability to define clear national interests and objectives. Of the United Nations Human Development Index, 11 of the top 20 nations have fewer than 10 million inhabitants. Norway, with just under 5 million people, is number 1. The UK is number 26. You can see in the advance of smaller countries in many other ways. When the United Nations was founded itself, it had 51 member countries. Now there are almost 200. As recently as 1990, Europe had 35 countries. Now it has 50. Of the 27 countries that currently make up the European Union, 6 of them did not exist as independent states before 1990. In that context, and looked in that way, Scotland's current constitutional status seems more and more like an anachronism. An independence which carries the right to participate as an equal on the international stage appears more and more like Scotland's natural state of being. Independence inevitably in the modern world goes hand in hand with interdependence. Our nationalism goes hand in hand with internationalism. Scotland will share a currency with the remaining members of the United Kingdom. We'll be a member of both the United Nations and the European Union. We'll participate as an active member of the international community. And of course, we will remain close friends of nations such as the United States of America, with which we share just such a long-standing ties of trade, of family, of friendship, ties which are epitomized by the life and the legacy of Andrew Carnegie. For all of these reasons, I believe that come September next year, Scotland will choose to be an independent nation. To quote Scotland's national bard, Robert Burns, in a song praised by Andrew Carnegie as the hymn of triumphant democracy, for all that and all that, it's coming yet, for all that. Or in the words of Thomas Jefferson, your own tribune of triumphant democracy, we are a people capable of self-government and worthy of it. Thank you very much.
As a Scot, I lean towards independence, but I wondered, could you clarify for myself and for everyone, I think, what the position of the Scottish National Government would be in terms of the currency if there was a yes vote?
That was part of the Fiscal Commission report, the one with Joe Stiglitz and Jim Mirrlees on it. They recommended that we stick with sterling. The reason that a currency union will work in a way that perhaps the euro illustrates where a currency union has difficulties is quite simple, that the rates of productivity, industrial productivity, export productivity in Scotland and England are very similar. In fact, Scotland over the last 2 years has been marginally higher. In the euro area, of course, you have divergent rates of productivity between the Ruhr Valley and the southern tip of Greece, which can approach 40 or 50%. So there's a huge instability within that currency union. But a currency union between Scotland and England will be it's an optimal currency area, to use the economic jargon. So the advantages of the currency union, in our view, outweigh the disadvantages, and that's the policy. The argument we make in terms of economic progress is the control of taxation, which incidentally I seem to remember a lot of people in this country thought was quite important just over a couple hundred years ago. So that's where we would seek to make the difference to our economic prospects as far as economic policy makes a difference through the judicious use of fiscal policy.
First Minister, what would the relationship of an independent Scotland be with NATO?
The SNP took a policy decision last October to be in favour of NATO. Of course, we would only be one party competing to be the Scottish Government. You know, that's a matter that's decided in elections, of course. But our policy position is to be in favour. The reasons for it are quite interesting. I don't think, incidentally, a single vote, or maybe some votes, but not very many, will be swayed by the SNP position on NATO. You know, whether you're a member of NATO or, like Ireland, a member of Partnership for Peace, for most people voting in this referendum would be not uppermost in their minds in terms of priorities. Why we took the decision was basically because of what our friends and partners thought, including the United States, but also partners like Denmark and Norway. And for these countries, Scottish membership in NATO is very important because the alliance covers a substantial geographic area, and a part of that substantial geographic area is Scottish territorial waters, which are strategically significant in terms of the North Atlantic. So we took the decision not to try and get votes in the referendum. We took the decision, and it was a difficult decision for the SNP, and I'll come to that in a second, We took the decision because we knew it was a signal to our friends and partners that we recognised their legitimate interest in the process of Scottish independence. Why was that a difficult decision? Because our objective would be to be a non-nuclear member of NATO. Nobody, I think, seriously would argue a country of 5.25 million people should possess nuclear weapons. I mean, but of course, Scotland currently hosts Europe's largest concentration of weapons of mass destruction. And that has been a burning issue in Scottish politics for 50 years. And it is difficult sometimes for people to separate the process of being a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, like the 25 non-nuclear members of that organization, from the possession of nuclear weapons. And so we've had to make the argument that being a member of NATO does not imply the possession of nuclear weapons. It's quite legitimate to be a non-nuclear member of NATO. And so for that reason, it was a vigorous debate, but it came to what I believe is the right result.
I have a double-barreled question. You make a very interesting and compelling case on the economic front for independence. That could be done by many countries or many parts of countries. And the underlying assumption, I think, of a community is an exogenous variable of a social value system that decides to pool at a certain social level rather than a higher or a lower social level. My question would be, firstly, what would the case be that you would make for independence based on that social value scale? And secondly, if the vote is no, are there alternatives? What political position would your party take?
The fundamental reason for Scottish independence is not that Scotland will be better off as an independent country. I believe it will be, but that's not the fundamental reason for independence. The fundamental reason for independence is Scotland is a nation, and nations, by and large, on the whole, are better governing themselves and allowing decisions to be taken by other nations for them. That I would submit as a generally recognised and understood. You may decide, of course, to pool sovereignty over certain things, but you still retain the sovereignty that you decide to pool. So Scotland, as an independent member of the European Union, would decide over certain areas to cede its sovereignty to European authority over commerce or the single market or competition law. But it would still retain the sovereignty. It would still be making that conscious decision. That's something that nations do to protect their national interest. Scotland is not in that position at the present moment. The policies that are pursued by the United Kingdom government, which could be described as, will certainly be unpopular, but hostile to Scottish interests, are not policies which they pursue by permission of the Scottish government. They are policies they pursue because, in their scheme of things, it is the Scottish government, the devolved parliament, which is a subsidiary parliament, and of course sovereignty is actually retained at Westminster. So as things stand at the present moment, I don't think it's going to do it, incidentally, but theoretically at least, Westminster could pass an act abolishing the Scottish Parliament, as well as passing legislation over reserved issues which may be considered inimical to Scottish interest. I mean, take an example. We have something which is famously called the bedroom tax, which is being introduced amid great controversy at the present moment. This is basically a reduction in the payments on social housing to people who've got a spare bedroom. The reason for this happening is because there have been soar-away rent levels in certain areas of the south of England, particularly in London and the southeast. There haven't been soar-away rent levels in Scotland, but that legislation is still being introduced in Scotland. You might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that people don't have an option to move to a smaller house. We haven't built a social housing stock in Scotland of single-room accommodations. We've built a social housing stock to give people the maximum freedom they can afford. People with disabilities who may need a room to store their equipment, people who are separated who may need a room when the kids visit. Or the idea that we should ask single mothers to take in lodgers, potentially with young children, so that they can finance the rent in their house. And that's an example of current legislation being introduced by Westminster, which, I don't think if it came to a vote in the Scottish Parliament, it probably, and the Conservative Party are always capable of surprising me, of course, but nonetheless, I would doubt it would gather a single vote in the entire Parliament. In terms of your other question, I love hypothetical questions. I really adore them. Generally speaking, I found it better to hypothesize on success rather than failure. This I have to submit is something that served me quite well in politics. I spent a lot of time as an opposition member of the House of Commons in London. And I mean, I must have been almost 20 years in politics before I realised an essential truth. And I kick myself sometimes for not realising it earlier. And that is to say that if you're engaged in a political debate and argument, then the only way a negative case will win is if there are two negative cases, and in which case the most negative case will win. If you have two arguments which are framed in negative terms, then the most negative case, the most bitter case, the most scaremongering case, the most fear-mongering case will win. If, on the other hand, you have a positive case set against a negative case, then that positive case will win. Why? Because at the end of the day, people want to do the right thing. The vast majority of people, confronting with any set of circumstances, want to do the right thing. People want to believe that things are capable of improvement, getting better. Andrew Carnegie spent a lifetime believing in the ideas of self and international improvement. And people react to a positive case. I found it better to make assumptions based on positive answers and not negative ones.
What else can I say but ask the audience to join me in thanking you so much for this very special program. Thank you, sir.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.